professor of psychology there, and I've been a licensed psychologist in Illinois since 1980. A little bit about my roots. I grew up in New York City in a predominantly Jewish community and went probably to the only Gentile church in the area, an independent congregational church, and married a woman who was raised in the United Presbyterian tradition. But I would say the formative spiritual influence in my life was a summer camp in upstate New York, run by the Plymouth Brethren, a place called Deerfoot Lodge. And that launched me into adulthood. And throughout most of my adulthood, I've been an Anglican and appreciate that tradition. And more recently, when I turned 60, started becoming a part of the Assemblies of God. So we're actively involved here at Calvary Church in Naperville. But I'm also a third culture kid. My in-laws and my parents were all missionaries, physicians, and my parents worked for many years with the Presbyterian Church in Chunju, Korea, in the Jesus Hospital. So I'd like to be, I'm proud of the fact that I've transcended all the major traditions of the Reformation. And as I say on my handout, I would like to believe I have the mind of St. Thomas Aquinas, the heart of John Wesley, the hands of Mother Teresa, the prayer book sensitivities of Thomas Cranmer, and the sheer brilliance of Martin Luther. But I'm very happy at Calvary right now. I appreciate the emphasis on prayer and scripture, and more recently, the emphasis on diversity and inclusion, a strong stance on social justice, and I love the fact that Marty preaches the word. Had a great run at Wheaton. My areas were different types of mental illness, what we call in the field psychopathology from the Greek, the study of the calamities of the soul, and also counseling and psychotherapy. And in the end of the outline, there are 2 co-authored books in their second edition on those topics if you're interested. But towards the end of my Wheaton career, I started noticing there were a couple of things that really caught my attention. Who copes well with the demands of everyday living? That's the conversation about resiliency. And then who screws up in life? That's the conversation about moral failure. And I don't know about your different districts, but boy, that's been all over the Chicagoland area, the moral failure. But also too, I'm also interested in why certain people cope well. And the study that I'm leading has 240 in-depth interviews with exemplars of people in ministry and the helping professions that are actually doing quite well. And it's 10 different countries, and internationally, the sample is clearly skewed in the charismatic tradition. So a book is forthcoming on that, but the bottom line is I think these are topics that should be of great interest to the superintendents of the Assemblies of God. So that's a little bit about me. Frankly, I think we're in the same business, trying to help people become men and women of depth and substance and helping the church become the church. So let's get into it.
Let's do it, Dr. Butman. And I think if we could just launch, first of all, into that area of some of the common threads that you have found in people who are experiencing longevity and health in ministry. What are some of the markers that are strong indicators of that? Or to say it another way, what could we build into a young minister that would help guarantee some of that good future path?
It's a great question, Larry. It's actually number 5 in my outline, but the most important thing for superintendents to know, it's about the relationships, stupid. The fancy way to say that is social support. So when you're trying to mold and shape the pastors in your district, probably the most important thing to ask them is, tell me about your friends. Not just the number, but the quality and the depth of the friendship. There's research on this for just about every disease and disorder studied, but the number one predictor of who copes well with demands of everyday living is what a friend we have in Jesus, but what a Jesus we have in friends. And the fancy name is social support. The second predictor, this is also under number 5, is your sense of meaning and purpose. What gets you out of bed in the morning, keeps you going during the day, and particularly helps you with the dark night of the soul. And finally, the belief that your choices matter and your commitments matter. The fancy word for that is your sense of efficacy. But here's the research, gentlemen and ladies. A, B, and C are 80% of the predictive factors for who copes well with demands of everyday living. So I think that's something to be aware of as superintendents. When people are isolated, they're not taking care of themselves, and they're frankly arrogant and prideful. That's a prescription, a disaster, prescription for disaster.
Try that 80% line again. I thought that was powerful, and I just like to put it in bold print.
Okay, it's letter D is the reference. There's a book called The Psychology of Religion and Coping by Ken Pargament at Bowling Green. Interesting enough, he's an agnostic Jew, but he reads the research very carefully. And he has a 2-volume book on research. And for about every disease and disorder study, those 3 factors, A, B, and C, can explain something like 80% of the potential outcome. So if you want to know where your congregants and pastors will be down the pike, be it a month from now, a year from now, a decade from now, if you know about their friendship patterns, if you know about what gives them meaning and purpose in life, and whether or not they believe that their choices and commitments matter, you can predict with great confidence what's going to happen. One of my closest friends, the recently retired president of Bethel University, and he gives a legendary talk: no easy choices, no insignificant decisions, and no unimportant people. So our choices matter, our commitments matter, and frankly, our community matters. So that would be probably the main thing I would say about effective coping and resiliency. Also, too, those same factors are teasing out cross-culturally in the international sample. It's about 110 people from 10 countries, as well as an equal number from North America, in a variety of helping professions, including ministry and missions and relief work and development work. But that's the main thing I want you to remember today. If you want to know how people are going to do with demands of everyday living, particularly in this confusing, complex world, know something about their friendship patterns.
So if one of our leaders is called upon to intervene in a situation of tragedy or malfunction or dysfunction and wants to bring a corrective course, based on what you're just telling us, what are some of the important things they would be looking for or recommending to a young minister who's trying to find his way?
That young minister needs really close friends that know them so well they could finish their sentences for them, but care enough about them to keep their fat mouth shut. I have that in print, so I'm quoting myself. But the bottom line is people can't do life well alone. And so helping them develop friendship patterns, ideally apart from the church, I think is incredibly important. So whether you're a healthcare provider, a superintendent, a minister, a missions executive, asking people to describe what their friendship patterns are like is really important. And helping them develop more friendships is really important as well.
You know, Richard, this is Doug Clay, and I think one of the things I've been observing in our fellowship is our districts, even with a name change, moving towards a ministry network versus a district is symbolic, trying to send the message that we care about the relational connectivity. And I do think it's important that even at some of our national, district, local ministry functions, we build time into that. I think the question I have is a younger generation that seems to connect digitally more than physically. Are you seeing any uniquenesses with the younger generation's relational connectivity versus, say, a boomer and a builder generation?
It's a great comment, Doug. The bottom line is youth today are not learning essential interpersonal life skills. It's the old, pattern, like use it or lose it. It's the law of atrophy. It's probably harder to develop deep friendships these days than it ever has been in the history of Christian ministry. And COVID-19 has not helped that at all. I would applaud the fact that the district superintendents are taking very seriously the primacy of relationships. As a psychologist, I cannot tell you how lethal isolation is for just about any type of mental illness or healthcare outcome. My parents were physicians, my in-laws were physicians, and what they learned in medicine was it's really important to know people's friendship patterns and familial patterns. The number one predictor of moral failure is the isolation and the arrogance and the pride that comes with that. The way they say it in medicine, it's more important to know what type of person has the disease and what disease the person has. That's one thing I really appreciate about Calvary. They pray as if it makes a difference, and they really believe in the efficacy of prayer. And my sense is that's why community is so important in the Assemblies of God tradition. And I would say, in terms of the themes that have characterized my thinking across the decades, was the importance of community, the importance of discernment, the importance of the stewardship of the mind and the body. But it is not a waste of time to develop friendship patterns within the church context and beyond the church context. Calvary's doing a real good job of pushing small groups lately. But again, that statement, what a friend we have in Jesus, but what a Jesus we have in friends. The truth of the matter, Doug, is people in leadership and ministry tend to be isolated, and they don't see the importance of the affirmation and accountability. And I think that's one reason why arrogance and pride is such an issue, is that people are not encouraged, but also not held accountable to what they know to be true. Left to our own devices, most of us will self-destruct, and even quicker when we're isolated.
Can you flip to the other side? I think you've touched on it a couple of points there, Dr. Butman, but some of the trends that you see where ministry crashes, ministry is truncated prematurely. Moral failure is one of the things you referred to, and that certainly is on our plate with some frequency, more than we want it to be. But what do you see as the indicators that could be warning signs that get us there, that we could intervene or intercept?
It's a great question, Larry, and this is number 4 in the outline. But the research has been clear for about 30 or 40 years, and I think this is of tremendous relevance to superintendents in the Assemblies of God. The most important thing to be monitoring is arrogance and pride. Pilgrim's Progress, the deadliest of the sins is pride. But I think the way some churches are structured these days, like the pyramidal approach with a certain person at the top, runs the risk of arrogance. And the antidote to the arrogance and pride is to be honest, humble, and humane. So with superintendents, monitor the pride factor. Some authors would say that's the most important thing to monitor. That research comes from studies of people in healthcare in different types of ministry in North America from about a decade ago. They did what they call psychological autopsies. They looked at people who screwed up in life, made tragic mistakes. And almost without exception, the top predictor was the arrogance and pride. So how you as superintendents teach people to be humble, honest, and humane is an important conversation. The second thing, and this is particularly dangerous in ministry, is isolation. I'm a human being, not a human doing. And I don't know how it is with the Assemblies of God, but I know how Wheaton College works. And, where your best is not good enough, so to speak, the nature of the beast in ministry is, if you do things well, to keep doing it more often and frankly, burn yourself out. There's a ton of research on people in ministry and how quickly they burn out, particularly youth pastors. But I think what happens is people get into a certain type of leadership style and they take charge and they become increasingly isolated. It's interesting to note that the rates of marital and family discord are pretty similar in ministry and outside of ministry. The number one request for help in our world right now is fix my marriage. The world, not just in North America. Number 2 is fix my family. And number 3, this is something we need to talk about, is trauma, particularly COVID-19 and recovery. So if you want to know what's troubling people in the pews, marital and family discord, but also too, traumatic life events. And I think whatever you can do to equip yourselves as superintendents to respond more effectively to people in crisis and people who have marital and family discord is time well spent. But the third one that's on that outline, that deserves hours of conversation, they used to talk about self-care, but now they talk about self-compassion. And to use Christian speak, it's the stewardship of mind, body, soul, and spirit. And it's not just getting in physical shape, but frankly, stewarding your mind. I come from a predominantly Jewish community where, the scholarship was viewed as holy, frankly, as worship. And I would like to see greater respect for the life of the mind, but also too for the life of the spirit and spiritual formation. So superintendents need to be seeing how their people are stewarding their mind, their body, their soul, and their spirit. My field is psychopathology, the study of mental illness, coming from the Greek, the study of the calamities of the soul. So I would say poor self-compassion is clearly a hazard to ministry. So if superintendents want to be helpful, ask candidly to the pastors, to the parishioners, how are you taking care of yourself? And not just getting exercise, and not just diet, and not just exercise, but what are you reading? Are you talking about important things with each other? And frankly, how is your soul coming? Larry and I have a mutual friend. His name was Bob Weber. He would often come up to you, how's your soul today? And that usually stops you dead in the track. But what are you doing to become a man of depth and substance? There's a book that Larry can give you, and it's by my dean. It's called Developing Clinicians of Character. And it's basically about the Christian virtues. And I think the lesson here might be for superintendents, you're developing pastors of depth and substance. That's the classic conversation about the Christian virtue. There's a lovely statement in the Mennonite tradition. Don't tell me what you believe. Let me talk to your neighbor about how you actually live your life. And as a child of the 60s, I can say this without apology. Are you smoking what you're selling? That's not a plea for marijuana as much as to say, if your beliefs and behaviors are inconsistent, it's tragic. In fact, if you want to look at the research, the number one predictor of young adults leaving the church is perception that role models did not practice what they preach. You superintendents are mentors, role models, exemplars. They catch truth from watching you behave. And if your beliefs and behaviors are inconsistent, lack of integrity, that's a serious warning sign. So again, those predictors are humbling. And frankly, I've seen this up close and personal with a number of churches that I deeply love in the Chicagoland area. And I've seen what happens. It's a bimodal distribution. For everyone who stays faithful, there's a person that leaves the faith because of hypocrisy.
Dr. Butman, one more question. I think you've talked about the value of building relationships that help sustain life and sustain ministry. And the easy answer is, oh yeah, I have friends. How do you knife through the superficial relationship that's just an answer back? Yeah, I got 5 friends, and find out that it's a relationship that's meaningful and of depth. How can you knife through that surface?
Well, the first thing I'd say, Larry, is you can't do that on Facebook or in a Zoom conversation. It's high touch, not high tech. In other words, sharing the same space. There's research on this too. The number one predictor of friendship formation, Larry's question is, how do you go deep? Is the sheer number of times your paths cross. It's called the principle of propinquity. And Zoom conversations like this are great, but there need to be people whose paths are crossing yours in person, where you get to know them so well, you know, you can finish their sentences for them, but care enough about them to keep your mouth shut.
Thank you. Doug, I'm going to go back to you and have you monitor just pulling in some other questions or comment. Certainly this is right down the center lane.
Yeah, boy, the self-compassion, that really intrigues me. I'm anxious to dive personally into that and share, but can I come back to the arrogance, leadership? So in our tribe, some of our most effective or growing leaders, they have a charismatic personality. They have some strong skill sets that to some outsiders could look as less than humble, more very dictatorial. In this, that it's a large predictor for moral failure. Can you talk to us about the discerning a strong type A charismatic personality versus cockiness and haughtiness that can lead to moral failure? Help us with that a little bit.
Well, I've seen this up close and personal, number of churches in the Chicagoland area. The conversation is about me, not we. That would be one way to discern it. A person who's frankly exhibitionistic, you know, and grandiose, If you want to be technical, the issue is aggressive narcissism. The world revolves around me. And frankly, that stands in stark contrast to the Christian gospel. You know, it's not me, it's we, but we are in the most individualistic culture in the history of humankind. And there's something about almost, dare I say, hero worship, where people are looking for someone who can tell them how to think, how to feel, and how to behave. And that is incredibly seductive. And I think to some extent, we have to be careful about roles and expectations and boundaries. And my sense is, you know, when you make decisions about who should be in leadership, you need to know about their private life, not just their public persona. And I think in a number of the cases in Chicago area, people were enormously skilled at entertainment, but that's not the gospel. You go to church to get your marching orders for the week, not to have a therapeutic deism type sermon. And I think there's something about our culture right now that's looking for the perfect guru out there. And I think to some extent, probably one of the least significant things for evaluating pastoral presence is the quality of their entertainment. You know, if you like King James language, and our pastor certainly does, there are 3 phrases that are consistent in the King James Version: confessing Jesus Christ as Lord, seeking after righteousness, and loving their brothers and sisters. And my sense is, if people decide whether or not to connect in a church because of a sermon that's entertaining, that's not the gospel. And the fancy name for it now is therapeutic deism. You know, it makes you feel good, but it doesn't satisfy deeply. There needs to be a hunger and a longing for something deeper. And since you're all superintendents, there is some fascinating research on sermon retention that I can bring up. It's just a little bonus. Most people who preach between 30 and 45 seconds, only 2 or 3 things I remember. The first thing they said, the last thing they said, and possibly something from an illustration. But if you see yourself as an expository preacher, which is what I like, which is what Marty does here at Wheaton, you got to be humble about what's remembered. And then you need to ask yourself, why do I spend half my week preparing a 45-minute sermon when the retention 15 minutes after the sermon's over is minimal? So that should humble you alone. It's not about packaging it. It's not about entertainment. It's about changed lives. And that's the gospel criteria. Is the person more likely to confess Jesus Christ as Lord? Are they likely to seek after righteousness? And are they to love their brothers and sisters? I frankly found some of the international interviews absolutely fascinating. There is not a cult of celebrity preachers internationally. I can say that about Africa and Latin America. That's a peculiar North American, Western European phenomena. In fact, sometimes these great exemplars would not be someone that would sort of stand out for reasons, but it's more about the quality of how they treat people, particularly their partners in life and their family and their community, that are the real telling of the Christian character. Wow. That's why I'm pushing this book by my dean, Developing Clinicians of Character. The conversation should not be how good the sermon is and how charismatic the personality is, but are they developing men and women of depth and substance? I'm a huge fan of the writings of Richard Foster on spiritual formation. And his opening line is, superficiality is the curse of modernity. What the world needs today is not more intelligent people, and I would add entertaining pastors, but deep persons. And that's what I hunger for.
Super. Let me pause here and ask if there's any of the leaders on the line, our network district superintendents, who either have a comment or a question, or you want to bring something up for discussion. I think we're small enough. If you just want to unmute and suggest something, go ahead.
Dr. Butman, I love this topic, and I was curious if you know, there's a difference between lonely and being loner. It's very discouraging on how many contacts you make to the loners that end up yielding nothing. So what is the best way for us to connect with those individuals who, you know, I think in our work, you have to learn just to accept and embrace the arrogant, but what advice would you give us on how to push through there in an authentic way? when you're rebuffed, or maybe your emails aren't returned for a couple weeks, or those kind of things? How would you suggest we reach out to them?
Well, tell me your name again.
Gene.
Gene, that's a great question, Gene. My response to that, it takes time. It's a trust issue. And people who are isolated tend to have been withdrawn sometimes for decades, and it takes a long time for those kind of patterns to be reversed. What the literature says, it's simple acts of kindness and compassion and concern over time that will sometimes bring out people who are, dare I say, profoundly introverted. A little bit of reality testing here. The most difficult personality trait to change is introversion, extroversion. In other words, there's not a lot of interventions that you can do to make an introvert a flaming extrovert. In fact, that's historically measured by in utero fetal movement. In other words, the more active fetal movement tend to become extroverts, and it tends to be a lifelong pattern. But I think different type of people present different challenges, and I think sometimes all you can say about increasing their friendship patterns is presence and perseverance and patience. And it's easy to connect with extroverts. I mean, they literally can take over the conversation in a nanosecond. But I think as I've aged, I'm 70 this week, I think the real challenge is helping people who are overly uptight and constricted to loosen up. I'm less patient with people who are frankly impulsive, inattentive, and inappropriate, if I can be blunt. And I think that's a huge mission field for the church, for the people who are frankly invisible and not coming to the attention of the pastoral staff. And my sense is the gospel is such that you minister to people with a variety of temperaments. But I would just basically say in summary, it's patience, it's presence, and it's perseverance. Frankly, to pursue it. And I think what happens, particularly with extremely lonely people, is they begin to notice, the long-term commitments that people do care, and they sometimes need to reverse the patterns. One other thing too is my wife is a clinician, works with deeply disturbed persons who are middle-aged and above, overwhelmingly introverts. And one thing we did not talk about, some of them are incredibly isolated and lonely because of traumatic life events like abuse, of violence and aggression. And sometimes we don't know the story behind the story. And sometimes if we do know the story behind the story, it might make us more patient and present and perseverant with people who are troubled. Again, mental illness comes from the Greek, psychopathology, the study of the calamities of the soul. And I would imagine in any congregation, it's full of troubled persons. But the worried well should not get all the attention. Sometimes it's the ones who are quiet, isolated, that deserve as much care and compassion and concern. And after all, we are supposed to be Christ's image bearer. And image is character, his compassion, his concerns. And that includes people of all different types.
In your section on predicting long-term faithfulness, unpack for us discipline reflections in difficult and challenging times.
I would say that has been the literature that has most fascinated me over the 41 years I was at Wheaton. The book that's mentioned in that section is The Fabric of Faithfulness, Linking Beliefs and Behaviors in the University Years. That's by Steve Garber. That's a great recommendation for superintendents. It basically says, if you want to predict long-term faithfulness, and the target population was college students and where they would be 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future, if you unpack that, there's striking consistency in the research. And the number one thing, and this is where superintendents come in, is access to authentic, credible role models, mentors, and exemplars. And again, probably the most important role that you have as superintendents is to be a role model, a mentor, an exemplar of, frankly, the Christian virtues and characters. The second predictor is the quiet kind of friendship patterns people have in those university years, particularly the kind of patterns that link beliefs and behaviors and help you with integrity. But the other one is actually my phrase from the literature. They're discipline, reflection in tough times. And frankly, COVID might be a gift to the church, if I can be honest, because simple answers to complex problems no longer seem to fit. I would say there's probably never been a time in my 70 years where it's been more important to do discipline reflection. And there's something about the refiner's fire, the crucible, as scripture talks about, that really produces depth. Frankly, superintendents, if you want to be men and women of depth and substance, be careful what you pray for, because the pattern in scripture, more times than not, is the path of suffering. And, you know, there's a great book by Jerry Sitzer called The Grace Disguised, How the Soul Grows Through Loss, which I would highly recommend. And my sense is loss is the pivotal experience of life. And, you know, it either can make us men and women of depth and substance, or it can shrink our soul. So I think you need to be honest that there are people in your congregations and pastors in your purview that are suffering tremendously, but how they see that suffering and how it becomes part of the enlargement of their soul makes all the difference in the world. One of Jerry's books is A Grace Disguised, How the Soul Grows Through Loss. And I would say at 70, I believe that more than I did when I was 20. But going back to the faithfulness theme, when you talk to people, for example, who graduated from Wheaton 10, 20, 30, 40 years out, we just had homecoming, they will tell you first and foremost, the mentors that shaped them at Wheaton. Then they'll talk about their friendship patterns, and then they'll talk about learning to do the difficult work when people are suffering.
Good, good, good.
I can see chat stuff there, but I can't read it.
No problem. Anybody else? Anybody else want to reflect or pose a question? Yeah, Don.
Yes, Doctor, just wondering if you may have already referenced a resource, but the isolation factor paired with the arrogance and pride, it speaks so clearly to high-level leaders who
Yes.
are more task-oriented than relational-oriented. And in our tribe, we have the nomenclature, the voluntary cooperative fellowship, which is kind of a gateway for people to stay isolated if they feel like it. And I'm wondering if you could point us to a resource that unpacks that isolation paired with arrogance and pride.
It's a great question. You superintendents ask good questions. Thank you very much for that. And they play into my deep interest. I would say anything from the Max Dupree Institute, DEPREE in California. Max Dupree was CEO of Herman Miller and wrote several books about mentorship. But for many years, the president of the Max Dupree Institute was one of my mountaineering partners, Walter C. Wright, WRIGHT. He was president of Regent College in Vancouver for 14 years and wrote 3 different books on relational mentorship. And I would say that's the best stuff I've ever seen in print on mentorship and leadership from a Christian perspective. Those of you know Regent College, that's quite an ecumenical, interdenominational kind of place. But he brought in several superstar professors and shaped them to be mentors first and foremost, not scholars and researchers and teachers. And that made all the difference in the kind of quality of the community at Regent. There are other leadership books that are out there, but frankly, nothing in on my bookshelves is better than anything by Max Dupree or Walter C. Wright.
Thank you.
He and I have been in a mountaineering group, gentlemen, for 51 years. We've been up and down the West Coast, and we had some wonderful, everyone was a PhD in the group at one point or another, and climbed most of the 14,000 footers on the West Coast. But the conversations we had up in the mountains over the years were to die for. Choice of words, deliberate. We're all retired now, we're all grandparents now, but in some ways, we would say that the mentorship thing was the most important thing we learned in our decades of ministry.
Daryl Wooten, did you have your hand raised or?
Sorry, I was waving at a friend.
Nope. Okay. Anyone else? We're at a 5-minute point. We have a few things that we'll announce and housekeep, but anybody else want to reflect or ask a question? Clayton?
Yeah, Doctor, is there a resource that you can point us to where we could ask those probing questions in interviews, in mentoring, that would be a way in which we could predict whether they're heading down the wrong path, that need to have a course correction, or just for us as superintendents to be aware of as we credential our ministers in our district?
Clayton, right?
Yes.
I have trifocals on. I can barely see the print. So I gave Larry this morning our interview protocol for our Aging Well and Ministry and Helping Professions. It has 14 questions on them. Each one is research-based. He can post that for you as a group. Plus, I can also give you a recent presentation I did to a group of Christian mental health professionals on what we found out internationally and in North America on that. And again, what you're going to see is the questions are all clustered around social support, sense of meaning and purpose, and frankly, sense of efficacy. Why do choices matter? So if you're going for those discerning sorts of answers, I would say it's one of those three sorts of broad themes. Also, too, in the outline that we sent you, the book that I co-authored called Modern Psychotherapies has a whole chapter on the Christian virtues and what it might be like to be Christ's image bearer in word and deed. So, so take a look at those, and I'm willing to have conversations with any of you about that. And the sequel to that book was Modern Psychopathologies, different types of mental illness. And I would imagine as superintendents, you see problems like psychosis, addictions, sexual dysfunctions and disorders, anxiety, mood disorders. And so it was our attempt to talk about that from a faith perspective. They're both for InterVarsity in their second editions. Great question. Is there a magic question, Clayton? No. But I think if your question at some level gets at humility, honesty, and respect for humanity, I think you're making progress. What you have to be careful about, Clayton, is impression management, sin management, depravity management. John Stott wrote about that, said North American Christians are a mile wide, but an inch deep. We used to call it psycho-Bible babble. People know what to say, but sometimes you have to get to times of crisis to find out what really they're made of. Hence the statement, loss potentially enlarges the soul.
Good. Excellent.